Good morning, everyone. I think we're ready to get started. So thank you for joining us today, and happy National Supply Chain Integrity Month. If you haven't gotten your Hallmark card yet, be sure to get one before the end of the month. I'm Larry Hanauer. I'm the Vice President for Policy at INSA. Thank you for joining us. I hope you all enjoyed the networking breakfast. Each April for the past 5 years, INSA's partnered with ODNI's National Counterintelligence and Security Center to draw attention to the critical supply chain vulnerabilities that threaten our national security. So INSA is pleased once again to help NCSC raise awareness of supply chain threats and promote best practices to improve supply chain resiliency. We have an outstanding program in store today. NCSC Assistant Director for Supply Chain Jeanette McMillan will share her insights on the national security impact of supply chain threats, vulnerabilities, and challenges. So thank you, Jeanette, for taking the time to be with us today. After her remarks, we'll hear from an incredible panel of experts who will address one of the most pressing supply chain challenges the United States faces today, ensuring the security of the software supply chain. We're particularly proud to welcome one of our panelists, Stephanie Keel of Google, who began her career as an INSA intern. So if you're impressed with what she has to say, our current interns are just as sharp, so hire them, you won't regret it. The cybersecurity news outlet Security Week described 2021 as the year of the software supply chain attack. One industry report found the number of software supply chain attacks tripled in 2021 compared to the previous year. And another study found that more than 3 in 5 companies were targeted by software supply chain attacks in 2021. As the past year began, the information security world was grappling with the SolarWinds attack, which had been revealed in December 2020. And as the year ended, we learned of vulnerabilities from Log4j, in which a ubiquitous piece of open source software that records events enabled third-party users to steal information, take control of targeted computers, and infect networks with malware. CISA Director Jen Easterly warned that the Log4j security flaw is the most serious vulnerability she's seen in her entire career, and that it could take years to resolve. The exploitation of software vulnerabilities has raised the bar for security requirements and highlighted the need for strong public-private partnerships to address this critical national security issue. So that's what we're here to discuss this morning. Before we begin, let me just make a few housekeeping notes. If you have questions, please write them down on the index cards that are at the center of your table. The INSA interns, who, as I mentioned, you should hire, will be walking around the room and will gather them and share them with our moderators. We're pleased to welcome members of the press to the program today, so this is a reminder that this event is being recorded and it's on the record. The program recording will be posted on INSA's website early next week. Finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Exiger, Guidehouse, and Sims Software for their critical support of this program. We could not deliver this kind of expert insight without the support of our partners. Now it's my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker. Jeanette McMillan serves as Assistant Director for the Supply Chain and Cyber Directorate at ODNI's National Counterintelligence and Security Center. In this role, she participates in interagency strategic programs and National Security Council initiatives to bolster the security of cyber and supply chains across the federal enterprise. Jeanette works closely with NCSC directorates, ODNI components, and other departments and agencies, specifically DHS and the Defense Department, to address supply chain security as a critical component of the National Counterintelligence Security and National Cyber Strategy. Prior to joining NCSC, she served as the Acting Deputy Inspector General of the Intelligence Community. Following her keynote, INSA Executive Vice President John Doyon will moderate a Q&A discussion with your questions. So please join me in welcoming Jeanette McMillan.
Thank you so much, Larry, for that warm welcome, and thank you, all of you. It's finally great to be in person, right? Instead of asking people to mute their microphones, I'm happy to say, silence your cell phones. But no, again, it is absolutely a pleasure to be here this morning with the INSA crowd, as well as to bring awareness to national, probably now international, Supply Chain Integrity Month. It is certainly something we've been celebrating here at NCSC along with our federal partners and industry stakeholders for the last 5 years, and we certainly know that 2021 is no exception in terms of trying to bring awareness to this critical counterintelligence issue in the way that we look at it. But I only wish I was here under more positive circumstances because, as I say in supply chain, the hits just keep on coming. COVID-19 showed the world that dominating supply chains yields tremendous power. We have a front row seat with the flurry of activities surrounding supply chain security, from software to semiconductors, meat packing to malware, pipelines to peanut butter. We have all seen how global supply chains are large and lucrative attack vectors, and our adversaries know it. 20 years ago, supply chain threats would not have even made the top 10 list. But now it's one of 5 strategic pillars that the National Counterintelligence and Security Center focus on under the National CI strategy. Why? Because our adversaries are focused on it. Today, they're targeting our critical infrastructure and supply chains for potential disruption. They are also targeting almost every sector of our economy and innovation base to acquire technology and trade secrets. Our main foreign intelligence competitors view themselves as already engaging in an offensive, multifaceted competition with the US. And the stakes just got much higher with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. We know that Russia poses a top cyber espionage, influence, and cyber attack threat to the US and its allies. Russia has capabilities to harm our interests across all 5 CI national security strategy pillars. And they continue to target critical infrastructure in the US and in allied and partner countries. Moscow has the ability to execute cyber attacks and generate localized, temporary, disruptive effects, such as disrupting an electrical distribution network. As Director NSA stated at the ATA hearings just last month, there are 4 critical areas in cybersecurity that Russia is targeting. Number 1, ransomware. And also, in that ransomware, he has seen that they are conducting attacks against allied nations and perhaps even for countries outside of the Ukraine in a spillover effect. Number 3, it's also interesting if they had decided to attack one of our adversaries would attack one of our allies with regards to responses to sanctions against Russia. And finally, once again, our critical infrastructure. That is definitely one of the 4, those are the 4 main pillars that we believe that Russia is going to use cybersecurity effects against. Director Wray also agreed with that and echoed and doubled down on the fact that the spillover effect from Russia is definitely real. And in the advisories and alerts that we've been seeing over the last few weeks, we've definitely been able to see an increase in that, which is why we've made very sure that we're moving forward with additional alerts and responses to critical infrastructure owners and operators. At NCSC, we approach these threats from CI and security perspectives. To borrow a term of art from our information security stakeholders, we are always looking for the CIA. Not the CIA at the CIA at Langley, but you know, the CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of supply chains. We want to make sure that those supply chain risks are reduced across the board and across the sector. And we all know about Executive Order 14028, and they've been instrumental in looking for cybersecurity vulnerabilities and risks and how we can make better opportunities for that. But the supply chains that we also need to be worried about go beyond cyber. There's software in every critical sector. And as we've identified in the reports under Executive Order 14017, that was America's supply chains. Each one of those reports identified critical risks to that sector through cyber nodes and also identified potential remedies and remediation as well as mitigations using cyber using cyber as a node to make sure that we can reduce those risks. Those critical areas are transportation, energy, agriculture and food, health and human sector with the PPE, as well as the defense industrial base, and of course, the ICT supply chain, the cyber supply chain. But from a national security perspective, we at NCSC have always known that the cyber supply chain is one that cuts across all of those sectors. And these sectors are being targeted through that particular supply chain. Take, for example, transportation. In 2017, the shipping giant Maersk was severely crippled by the NotPetya cyber attack, which was spread through an infected upgrade to a widely used software package by the Russian Intel Service. Energy sector. In 2021, the FBI confirmed that the DarkSide ransomware attack was behind the Colonial Pipeline networks and had to shut that one down. Last year, 2021, in June, the White House announced that meat production in North America was disrupted by, again, another ransomware attack under the JBS market, one of the world's largest suppliers of meat. And in that particular 3-day shutdown, it affected 20% of meat production of pork and 25% of meat production of beef. At the time, the White House had stated that it was engaging directly with the Russian government on this matter, delivering the message that responsible states do not harbor ransomware criminals. We know now that the Our Evil group was behind that attack of this company, which raised concerns of rising prices, availability of meat in production across the world. For HHS, we know COVID-19 brought together several ransomwares and phishing attacks and scams with regards to vaccines, with regards to hospital supply chains, and then also with PPE supplies. And the Defense Department has seen an explosion of cyber attacks with regards to the defense industrial base in terms of the nation-state actors. The Defense DIB has over 220,000 companies that support the defense industrial base. How are those cyber attacks going to be measured with regards to mitigating that in that particular space for the critical defense missions that we need them to continue to do with regards to cyber effects? And last but not least, the ICT, the supply chain sector report was conducted by Department of Commerce and the Department of DHS. And they assessed that supply chains for this critical sector and subsectors are all supported by the ICT industrial base. From hospitals to small businesses, all estimated that 84% of US households own smartphones and 78% own desktop laptop computers. Yet, as the global semiconductor shortage demonstrates, the US economy is vulnerable to disruptions in this critical supply chain. So what does all of this mean? CSCRIM, cyberscrim challenges are intensifying with profound implications for US security and resilience. But cybersecurity doesn't start when the incident. So cybersecurity, in our opinion, at NCSC starts with supply chain risk management. As the cyber attacks of 2021 have shown, near-peer adversaries increasingly employ acts of provocation and coercion in the cyber domain through global supply chains. The first rule in espionage is identifying the intentions of foreign adversaries. In supply chain security, this is even more challenging because nation-state actors can easily hide. They can easily hide in the noise of normal business, a la SolarWinds. Everyone was just doing the required updates. They were doing their cyber hygiene, making sure that they were patching on time and regularly. Or they can hide in the chaos of cybercrime with ransomware. When a cyber attack occurs, the victim company, government, nonprofit, or network entity just wants the bad actors gone, foregoing the opportunity, from our perspective, to understand how the attack occurred, and most importantly, from a CI and security perspective, why. Remember the quote from the infamous bank robber, Willie Sutton? Why did he rob banks? That's where the money is. Why are they using cyber? Because that's where the data is. And in today's day and age, data equals money. And software is the ATM for data, or rather, the ATD, access to data. So that is why this year we have focused on software supply chain. When we say fortify the chain, that is the chain that we mean. Software provides access to all digital infrastructure, and digital infrastructure is the backbone of all businesses, governments, universities, health and safety organizations, and social services. Every aspect of modern life depends on digital infrastructure. So why are major parts of the infrastructure dependent on volunteers? For development, for maintenance, for security. Would we allow the Beltway to be repaired by volunteers? Would we allow the parts of the metro system to be secured by volunteers? When an incident occurs, are there cyber firefighters? Are they volunteers? Should they be? Taking a page from the counterterrorism playbook, within days of 9/11, we knew the who, the what, the how, and a solid why of those deadly attacks. FBI and state and local enforcement agencies were responsible for investigating what happened. It wasn't left to volunteers. We took steps to plug the physical flaws in our security, to close the information gaps within government circles, and to increase our vigilance so it never happens again. We all want the same response in the cyber realm, in the cyber domain, but the CT playbook is not applicable in some instances. It's like taking the playbook for the New York Giants and applying it to the San Francisco Giants. No hits. We have to adjust for the digital environment, but apply the security principles learned in the physical environment. We have to add private sector partners to the lineup to ensure they know what to do when a cyber curveball comes their way. We have to adjust the plays, but not the desired outcomes. Never happens again. One of the major ways that we can do that is through information sharing. And I know, we say it all the time, and you're talking to someone who has been trained for the past 20 years to keep secrets, to not share information, but this is how it's getting done. We are the first ones to admit that information sharing needs to be improved across the board. To take a cue from the new cyber director, Chris Inglis, the government is in the supporting role to the ICT industry, the network defenders, and the critical infrastructure owners and operators who need to be supported with actionable information to mount a solid defense. In addition, CISA and FBI have provided classified briefings to critical infrastructure sectors, as we've seen in recent weeks. One specifically for the energy infrastructure was issued on April 13th from CISA, FBI, NSA, and DOE to ensure that potential cyber attacks against SCADA systems and ICS systems were definitely with the shields up, especially with regards to the West's involvement in Ukraine, to make sure that those shields were up. Just last week, on April 20th, we partnered with our Five Eyes to make additional alerts out there for, again, cyber infrastructure and digital infrastructure across the globe in all 5 of these countries, warning individuals of malicious cyber activity, again, because of the support that we're giving to Ukraine and Russia. These information sharing efforts demonstrate the strategic shift from the CT playbook I mentioned earlier. Not only do we need the private sector on the team, we need them ready to bat. We need them to say, hey, put me in, coach. One of the major adjustments is the increased partnership with private sector who may actually be volunteering in certain instances to keep pieces of the digital infrastructure going. Log4j is the prime example. Unbeknownst to the government, industries that rely on this same software, benefiting the development, benefiting from the maintenance, and benefiting from the security of a small army of software soldiers that are out there. Before we even get to potential cyber intrusions or the identification of a vulnerability that, in the words of CISA Director Jen Easterly, as Larry already mentioned, was the most serious vulnerability she has seen in her decades-long career. Why? Because of the ubiquity, simplicity, and complexity of just one piece of software. But that's why in supply chain we say, is that software that's in your system, is it ready, and is it ready to be available? Is it ready to be resilient? Is it placed in your system in a way that you know exactly what it does? Why do you have that particular piece of software? What does it do? Is it in that functional critical role, or is it something that can be foregone? Does it need to be updated? Who made it? Who sold it to you? If we must, can we replace that software and still keep at an operational tempo? What are the costs for doing that upgrade? What are the costs for not doing it? Cyber hygiene, as I said before, starts with cyber supply chain, especially when it comes to critical software acquisitions. We must fortify the chain, and we must know what is in the software supply chain. In addition to information sharing with our industry partners, Congress made a little law a couple of years ago called the Secure Technology Act. And it made sure that federal government organizations had the information it needed to make sure that federal networks were secure. In addition to that, Congress went beyond and said, hey, the intelligence community, Director of National Intelligence, you will certainly start making sure that we standardize information sharing across the federal enterprise on supply chain risks, counterintelligence risks, and cybersecurity risks, and make sure that that information is provided to federal acquisition professionals across the government This also includes federal sector risk agencies that have the know-how to communicate with industries that are out there making sure our critical infrastructure is secure. So we all have to do our part, and information sharing is just one of them. So how do we mitigate once we've identified those risks? Again, information sharing is key, but if we are finding ourselves in an incident, what are the mitigations? U.S. companies should certainly raise their vigilance and be prepared for the possibility of cyber intrusions from Russian and others, including a range of criminals and hacktivists who have taken sides in this conflict. Companies who should consider the potential for collateral damages from cyber attacks related to the conflict impacting individuals and organizations far away from the actual kinetic fighting. The White House and other federal agencies, including the CISA, FBI, and NSA, have issued many cybersecurity advisories. Please take heed. I would advise companies to pay close attention to these notices and act on their recommendations. Companies also, as I said before, need to think beyond just cyber and should be prepared to defend against multiple different attack vectors. Nation-state operations often combine many different tools and approaches to achieve their ends. Many of them also will use supply chain attacks, witting and unwitting insiders, and they may also have blended operations that combine some or all of these TTPs. Similarly, U.S. companies should be aware of some of the legal and quasi-legal methods used by state actors and their proxies to acquire technology or talent, including investments, mergers and acquisitions, joint ventures, partnerships, scientific academic collaborations, and again, talent recruitment. We also have organizations that for their software supply chain defenses, we offer some of the basic CI steps. I won't go through all of them here, but definitely one of the most critical is conducting your own risk assessments to identify where your crown jewels are, to assess and prioritize those critical assets, systems, and processes that make your business run. One of the issues that Colonial Pipeline found out when it was in the midst of its cybersecurity attack was that the IT and the OT needed to be separated, so they shut the OT down for fear of further dissemination of the malware that was in the information technology systems. Managing the supply chain security has got to be a primary metric, along with your cost, schedule, and performance. Include those supply chain security requirements in the contract, so that if there is a breach, that you have an obligation from your vendors and suppliers to be notified of those breaches. Also, you have to manage the SCRM risk when terminating relationships and third-party vendors. Do they still have access to your data? If the relationship is terminated, then why? Develop and implement workforce training and managing and mitigating and responses to CSCRM activities. There's so much that we can do on the technology side, but if someone makes that one click, makes that one link, opens that one document, is your entire organization at risk? In sum, securing the software supply chain is of the interest of us all. Whether it is open source software like Log4j or proprietary software as we saw in SolarWinds, the impact, again, of one click, one unpatched node, or one refusal to pay a ransom may have catastrophic consequences. We need to continue to share supply chain threat information more widely and more robustly within the private sector defenders who own or operate 80% of the critical infrastructure. Until we can secure the digital infrastructure in the same manner as we are securing the physical infrastructure, both will be more susceptible to these cyber risks. If we want to realize the full potential of cutting-edge technologies like quantum and AI, we must fortify the chain. If we want to protect critical infrastructure, water, oil, gas, electricity, we must fortify the chain. If we want to safeguard access to healthcare and food supplies, we must fortify the chain. And if we want to realize the full potential of the cyber domain, we must. But we can only do it together. So thank you so much for listening to my remarks, and I will take a few questions. Thank you. All right.
this working? Yes, it is. First, let me say thank you, Jeanette. Those were really great comments and remarks, and gave us a lot to think about this morning. And thank you for coming out, and it indeed is nice to be here in person with you today. So there are some interns around, and if you have questions, please write them down on some of those cards. I'd love to be able to ask Jeanette your questions, so please send them on in. But I got a couple to start with already. And the first one here, you were mentioning Russia. So you supply chain here. Let me see.
Okay, so it wasn't user error. Okay, let's just sit back, relax, and listen to the smooth sounds of supply chain risk management. Thank you for joining us. We're having a small technical difficulty.
We'll share.
Okay, that sounds good.
It's public-private partnership right here. So back to Russia. You mentioned Russia. And the question is, even though we really haven't seemed to see a lot of cyber attacks yet, should we expect Russian-sponsored software-based attacks to contribute to the Russia-Ukraine crisis, attacking either Ukraine or its allies or us? And when is that all going to happen?
Thank you, John. As I look into the crystal ball, but no, I appreciate the question. Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely, we should certainly expect those issues, but not in any sort of time frame. But I believe that the results of the alerts that have just been pushed out, especially the one that was just pushed out, I believe, on April 20th, it is definitely a shields up moment. And if we've done some of the cyber hygiene things that we've been doing all along, then we should be in a good position. But we also need to make sure that those particular nodes are resilient and that we are able to defend them within the cyber domain. So when we're saying shields up and we're saying make sure that we're doing that risk-based analysis and the risk-based management for resiliency, there's a reason behind that. And I think that looking to the directors for CISA, the FBI director, as well as even the folks at the cyber, Chris Inglis, have said that it's definitely something that we need to be conscious of, but we need to make sure that we're pushing forward with not necessarily in a threat mindset, but in a resilient mindset, and making sure that we're making those different actions more resilient with regards to the specific threats from the Russia-Ukraine incident.
Hey, I'll follow up on this idea of shields up. And shields up implies that people have shields, and then they know how to raise them. And so the question, maybe you want to comment on that a little bit, but also how does an adversary like Russia or China or anyone else, how did they infiltrate the software supply chain to create vulnerabilities? And when the instruction is to raise your shields up, you know, is that well understood what protections actually are required and how those should be implemented?
Thanks, John. Yeah, no, another great question. And I think one of the things that we can look back to is Executive Order 14028, which said one of the things that we needed to do was look at the infrastructure between OT and IT. And if you are one of those industries that has that sort of infrastructure, are you providing the correct sensors on that infrastructure? And then also the other issue for certain individuals with regards to whether or not you have shields, what are your basic cyber hygiene policies? What are those issues with regards to how often you test your cyber incident reflexes, if you will? One of the things that folks have been saying, well, we haven't seen a lot of, major cyber incidents or major cyber issues. Could be one or two reasons for that. I want to take a positive note on it and say it's probably because Ukraine, they got a lot of muscle memory on this. Let's look back to NotPetya. Let's look back to 2014. Let's look back to the impacts that their particular infrastructure, the hits that they've had to survive from. They probably have got a lot of resilience built up, a lot of muscle memory, and they also have a little bit of help as well. But that's where I think people need to take caution, and one of our colleagues in New Zealand said, we've seen this before. We've seen this playbook before, and we know how this play can be ended. So take heart, take heed, but there's definitely things that one can do, and certainly implementing your cyber hygiene as we've outlined in Executive Order 14028.
Thanks for that. Another question. So you mentioned the Defense Industrial Base. So with over 220,000 companies in the DIB, plus countless others in other sectors, it's difficult for the U.S. government to provide actionable information on cyber and software threats. How can the IC, FBI, DCSA, and others support such a large range of infrastructure providers with actionable intelligence? And do the agencies need more resources to do this?
Thank you for that, John. Yes, we definitely have seen an uptick in the cyber attacks and cyber nodes, and I think more information sharing and looking at what we have across the board with regards to some of the things that we've put on the books. For example, the Federal Acquisition Security Council that I mentioned, the Information Sharing Task Force that the DNI leads, these are all areas where we have information that is available and can be processed and provided to critical infrastructure sectors who are working with those industries on a routine and daily basis. So risk sector agencies are our target from an IC perspective to make sure that they're getting that information to those industries that are owning and operating over 80% of our critical infrastructure so that they can get that information in real time. Also, as we heard a couple of weeks ago, several industry leaders and infrastructure leaders and owners were brought in and received classified briefings specific to the threats that we were seeing. So additional information sharing opportunities like that when it is warranted are something that we have seen and I believe in an unprecedented way that we've been able to share information, share additional information as that goes along.
Okay, I knew this was going to come. We have a fortify the chain question. So, and the question is, what would be some repercussions or effects of an adherence to a made in the USA policy as one way to approach the fortify the chain issue? And also thinking about that is, could that, also perhaps weaken the chain if we took that approach?
No, that's an absolutely great question. And I think that there are some certain software development code.gov, for example, comes to mind with regards to code that is indeed open source code that's available. I believe Canada, New Zealand also have government developed code that is out there. But as I was saying before, whether it's open source or whether it's proprietary software development, it's global. And it's in everything that we're doing. So it's one of those things where, sure, you can say that it's made here or it's made there, but what does it really do when it comes into your environment? Do you understand the software bill of materials? Just like the ingredients, do you know what's in there? And it may be in there and it may be okay. I often, during COVID, took on some additional baking challenges. I'm a baker, and trying to bring my daughter along with that, and that was definitely not she said, hey, what are we doing with this particular thing? Well, I said, let's add the eggs. Well, she added the eggs and the melted butter at the same time. Guess what we got? So when you're putting all the ingredients together and you don't understand exactly what those ingredients are, number one, but then number two, how they work together, that's why software bill of materials is one of those areas where we want to know exactly where it is, to include the origin of the code, but we want to know exactly what it is and what it does in our system.
Great. Here's another question. Thank you. Got some audience questions coming in now. Regarding critical infrastructure sector, how do you see cyber risks affecting the physical security of the various assets of the different critical infrastructure sectors and their subsectors? For example, how would cyber risks affect the physical security at ports of entry?
Yeah, thank you for that. We can definitely go back to the NotPetya example as an example of how cyber risk and cyber intrusions, ransomware in that particular case, were impacting the physical infrastructure that we saw with the shipping software that was impacted by in the MERS situation. So yes, there are definite physical effects with regards to both the critical infrastructure and the digital infrastructure coming together in a cybersecurity attack that we definitely want to guard against, which is why we've been so adamant about making sure that our critical infrastructure nodes and we understand exactly what that particular software package does. That's why NIST came up with its definition of critical software so that they could understand exactly where those software implications are that will have a physical impact.
Thank you. Here's another question. Gets to something you mentioned about volunteers. And it says, how do we solve the problem of relying on volunteers? By the way, perhaps everybody likes to read the headlines when it say that somebody's been, hacking into Russia, and it looks like some volunteers or somebody's doing it. That always makes me feel good. But anyhow, how do we solve the problem of this relying on volunteers? Should we stop allowing free and open source software, or start supporting more critical free and open source software? Or how can we start to address this?
Thank you. I think one of the main issues with open source software is that it is here to stay. And it needs to stay, and volunteers, not in a pejorative way at all. There are parts of the cloud right now that are 100% supported by certain nodes of particular software code, and that's definitely not going to change. How do we fortify that? How do we make sure that that particular piece of code is sustained or sustainable, or more importantly, is fortified with other additional pieces of code that happen? And I think one of the keys to that is having the open source security summit that was happening earlier this year in January. And I believe making sure that it is an industry and a public-private partnership that comes together on those particular issues. And that was one of the other areas from a critical software security standpoint where NIST was supposed to go and do its standard thing, but they knew that they couldn't do so without the industry input. And so making sure that we understand where those critical nodes are, how many folks are reliant upon it, and then devising a way to make sure that those volunteers are further supported without breaking anything.
Thanks. Back to another related to fortify the chain, and this one is more about workforce skills. So what are the biggest workforce skill gaps in being able to fortify the chain over the next, say, 5 years?
Yes, that is definitely a critical area for all of us in terms of trying to figure out exactly, do you need a cyber expert or do you need an expert in that industry and in that field to be more cyber savvy? And I think right now we're trying to make sure that folks are much more cyber savvy in their own field. Take, for example, we usually go typically with a security apparatus, guards, gates, and guns, right? But when you put a sensor on that gate and that sensor is internet enabled, that guard needs to understand that he's now become responsible for digital infrastructure, not just the physical gate itself. So when we can educate people in their space as to how they are interacting on a daily basis, whether it's their industry, whether it's their mission, whether it's their particular set of skills that need to be upgraded, that's exactly what we need to do to make sure that everyone has better cybersecurity and is more savvy where they are making sure that their mission meets those needs as we continue to rely upon additional digital infrastructure, as we continue to rely upon technologies and everything to make our mission move.
Thanks. So here's another question. It's a bit of a read-in for this one, so listen up. My office has tried to organize the agency's risk considerations for the energy sector, in our case, around 3 separate lines: software supply chain threats, as in SolarWinds, hardware supply chain threats with counterfeit or compromised devices introduced, and what we call traditional SCRM, with a wide range of risk factors possibly affecting critical component availability. Here's a question. These are all interrelated but distinct. What risk do you see in organizations fortifying the chain on one of those lines but overlooking the others?
First of all, the fact that you've identified 3 lines of risk, kudos to, to whoever has gotten that, their industry or their organization to buy in on that. And I think that's where having that C-suite or that top line buy-in at the top of the head of the organization, because as the question points out, all of those things are interrelated and intertwined. You can't do one without the other, but you can do them smartly. And so that's where you need to make sure that across those lines, people understand from a business perspective, you're going to either start raising revenues or you're going to reduce risks. And your SCRIM program needs to be reducing risks. Why? Because it's not going to raise revenue. So it's definitely one of those risk versus reward sort of dichotomies, but at the same time, if you recognize what a SCRIM program can do across the board, reducing those risks allows to have that opportunity to raise additional revenue. So I think you can't do one without the other, but you can do it smartly, and the fact that you've already identified where those buckets are for your organization, you're well ahead of the game.
Okay, I think this will be our last question before we give you a chance to wrap up. And the question is, CISA's Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, JCDC, works with 22 energy and telecom companies that would likely see early indicators of a cyber attack on U.S. infrastructure. Do you at NCSC have a similar small group of, say, canaries in the coal mine who might provide indicators of a software-based attack? If so, how do you work with them?
Great question. And yes, definitely hats off to the JCDC and the successful inputs that organization has already seen and the strides that they've already made. NCSC has definitely been on the forefront of this for quite some time. And in fact, we've been leading the supply chain risk management for the intelligence community in the almost 10 years now, when our directive internal to the intelligence community was signed out. And we've got a lot of experience and got a lot of technical expertise in that particular domain. As I had mentioned before in my remarks, the DNI now has a task force that is required to standardize information sharing of supply chain and counterintelligence and cybersecurity risks. As part of that task force, that's where we're supposed to be getting out as the Director of as Director NCSC is supposed to do statutorily, give that information and warning to the private sector. And we've definitely done that with regards to supply chains in the industry sector, chambers of commerce, and other areas where we know we've seen those things in conjunction with our other federal partners, with FBI as well as DHS CISA. So there's definitely some overlap, which is great, but it's also something where there's never a shortage of information sharing. Particular groups like JCDC, we're welcoming them to the team, and we certainly know that they're going to be able to make some big hits and wins with the industries they support.
Great. Any closing thoughts for us as you wrap up your part of the program here?
First of all, thank you again for inviting me and having me here. It's been wonderful to be here with these particular industry stakeholders, as well as some government friends in the audience I've seen. But I really do wish, even though we're wrapping up Supply Chain Month, it is definitely 12 months in a year. You can certainly continue to do it. But I hope that you all take heed, take some additional information, and make sure that you and your organizations have taken every step you can to fortify your chain. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Round of applause, please.